Chapter 1. The Land Before Rome. In the beginning, there was only the land. Long before the name of Rome was whispered among mortals, long before the first stone was laid upon the Palatine Hill, there existed a gentle landscape of rolling hills and quiet river valleys in the heart of the Italian peninsula. This was a land shaped by ancient forces, carved by water and time, blessed with fertile soil and warmed by the Mediterranean sun. Here, beneath skies that stretched endlessly blue, the Tiber River wound its way through green valleys toward the distant sea, its waters cool and clear, reflecting the clouds that drifted lazily overhead. The 7 hills rose from the plain like the curved backs of sleeping giants. The Palatine, the Capitoline, the Aventine, the Quirinal, the Viminal, the Esquiline, and the Caelian. Each had stood silent and unnamed for countless generations, their slopes covered in oak and laurel, their summits crowned with wild grasses that swayed in the gentle wind. In spring, wildflowers bloomed in profusion across these hills, painting the landscape in shades of yellow and purple and white. In summer, the cicadas sang their endless song from the trees, and the air grew thick with the scent of pine resin and sun-warmed earth. This was Latium, the land of the Latins, a region inhabited by simple farming communities who lived in scattered villages, their round huts thatched with straw, their lives governed by the turning of the seasons and the cycles of planting and harvest. These people tended their flocks of sheep and goats on the hillsides, cultivated their small plots of emmer wheat and barley in the valleys, and gathered beneath ancient oak trees to honor gods whose names are now lost to history. They were not a people of great cities or vast armies. They were a people of the earth, their hands calloused from the plow, their faces weathered by sun and wind. The Tiber itself was a presence, a living entity that gave and took away with equal measure. In the dry months, it ran shallow and gentle, its waters moving slowly between sandy banks where herons stood motionless, waiting for fish. Children played at its edges, splashing in the cool shallows, while women washed clothes on the smooth stones, their voices carrying across the water. But when the rains came in winter, the river transformed. It swelled and darkened, rushing with tremendous force, carrying branches and debris from the mountains far to the north. Sometimes it overflowed its banks, flooding the low-lying areas, leaving behind rich silt that would nourish the next season's crops. At a certain point along the river's course, there was an island. It rose from the water like the back of a great turtle, dividing the current into 2 channels. This island would later be called the Tiber Island, and it served as a natural crossing point, a place where the river could be forded with relative ease. Here, ancient paths converged, routes that connected the villages of Latium with the territories of the Sabines to the northeast and the Etruscans to the north. Merchants and travelers paused at this crossing, resting in the shade of the willows that grew along the banks, exchanging news and goods before continuing their journeys. The land held memories. In the hills and valleys of Latium, there were places considered sacred, where the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of the gods grew thin. Natural springs bubbled up from the earth, their waters cold and pure, believed to possess healing powers. Certain groves of trees were left untouched by the axe, consecrated to divine presences that dwelt among the shadows. On certain nights, when the moon was full, shepherds claimed to hear strange music drifting across the hills, the sound of pipes played by woodland spirits, the laughter of nymphs dancing in the clearings. The Latins shared this landscape with other peoples. To the north, across the Tiber, lay the territory of the Etruscans, a civilization far more advanced than their southern neighbors. The Etruscans built cities of stone, created magnificent works of art, and practiced divination by reading the entrails of sacrificed animals and interpreting the flight of birds. Their influence extended across central Italy, and they traded with the Greeks and Carthaginians, bringing exotic goods and new ideas to the peninsula. The Etruscans possessed knowledge of metalworking, creating bronze helmets and weapons, elegant jewelry, and tools that the Latin farmers could only admire from afar. To the east and northeast lived the Sabines, another Italic people who spoke a language similar to Latin. They were hardy mountain folk, known for their strength and their fierce independence. The Sabines raised cattle and cultivated the fertile valleys that lay between the Apennine ridges. They were warriors when necessary, defending their lands against raiders, but they were also deeply religious, maintaining ancient traditions and honoring their ancestors with solemn rituals. In this world of small communities and ancient traditions, stories were the currency of wisdom. Around evening fires, the elders spoke of the old times, of heroes and monsters, of divine interventions and terrible curses. They told of how the gods had created the world, how certain families were descended from immortal beings, how the landscape itself had been shaped by titanic struggles between supernatural forces. These stories were not mere entertainment. They were the framework through which the people understood their place in the cosmos, the explanation for why things were as they were. The sky above Latium was a theater of divine activity. The people watched the heavens carefully, noting the appearance of comets, the patterns of lightning during storms, the flights of eagles and hawks. Each sign carried meaning, a message from the gods about future events, warnings about dangers, or approval for proposed actions. Thunder rumbling from the left was considered auspicious. Lightning striking an oak tree might indicate divine anger. The priests who could interpret these signs held great power, for they spoke with the authority of heaven itself. As the centuries passed, the villages of Latium slowly grew. Families built their huts closer together, seeking the protection that numbers provided against wolves and raiders. Rough palisades of wooden stakes were erected around settlements, creating the first fortifications. Trade increased, with salt from the coastal marshes being exchanged for grain from inland farms. Wool from the hill country traded for bronze implements from Etruscan merchants. The population gradually expanded, filling the valleys and claiming more of the hillsides for cultivation. Yet the land remained essentially unchanged. A pastoral landscape where shepherds guided their flocks across meadows dotted with wild roses, where the song of birds filled the air at dawn, where the Tiber continued its eternal journey to the sea. The 7 hills stood as they had always stood, silent witnesses to the slow passage of time, waiting for the moment when they would be transformed into something no one could yet imagine. The sun rose and set over Latium, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. The seasons turned in their endless cycle. Spring brought new life, summer brought abundance, autumn brought the harvest, and winter brought rest. And in this rhythm, in this ancient pattern of life and land, the stage was being set for a story that would echo through all the ages to come. A story of brothers and betrayal, of gods and mortals, of a city that would rise from these quiet hills and eventually cast its shadow across the entire known world. But that story had not yet begun. For now, there was only the land, waiting. The Palatine Hills stood empty, covered in wild grass and thorn bushes, home to nothing but rabbits and foxes. The Tiber flowed peacefully between its banks, unaware of the bridges that would one day span its width. The air was clear and silent, broken only by the calls of shepherds to their flocks, the bleating of goats, the distant cry of an eagle circling high above. And somewhere in this landscape, in the interplay of earth and sky, river and hill, mortal life and divine will, the seeds of Rome were germinating in the darkness, preparing to push toward the light. Chapter 2. The Tale of the She-Wolf. In the ancient city of Alba Longa, built on the slopes of the Alban Hills, southeast of where Rome would one day stand, there lived a king named Numitor. He was a descendant of Aeneas, the Trojan hero who had fled the burning ruins of Troy and sailed across the wine-dark sea to establish a new life in Italy. Through Aeneas's son Ascanius, a line of kings had ruled Alba Longa for many generations, and Numitor had inherited this sacred legacy. He was a just ruler, beloved by his people, who governed with wisdom and compassion. But Numitor had a brother named Amulius, and in Amulius's heart there burned the dark fire of ambition. While Numitor concerned himself with the welfare of his subjects and the proper observation of religious rites, Amulius dreamed of power. He gathered supporters among the ambitious nobles of Alba Longa, men who believed they would prosper under a stronger, more aggressive king. Through cunning and conspiracy, through whispered promises and hidden threats, Amulius orchestrated his brother's downfall. The coup was swift and brutal. Amulius's soldiers surrounded the palace in the darkness before dawn, and when the sun rose, Numitor was king no longer. Amulius claimed the throne, and though some voices were raised in protest, they were quickly silenced. Numitor himself was spared, perhaps out of some lingering fraternal feeling, or perhaps because killing him outright might have provoked a rebellion. Instead, Amulius allowed his deposed brother to live, but stripped of power, reduced to the status of a private citizen. Yet Amulius was cunning, and he understood that his hold on the throne would never be secure as long as Numitor had descendants who might challenge his rule. Numitor had no sons. They had died in the fighting during the coup, or perhaps they had been murdered on Amulius's orders. The histories are unclear. But Numitor had a daughter, Rhea Silvia, a young woman of remarkable beauty and virtue. In her flowed the blood of Aeneas, and any son she bore would have a legitimate claim to the throne of Alba Longa. Amulius made a decision that he believed would eliminate this threat forever. He declared that Rhea Silvia would become a Vestal virgin, consecrated to the service of Vesta, goddess of the hearth and home. The Vestal virgins were priestesses who tended the sacred fire in Vesta's temple, a flame that must never be allowed to extinguish, for it represented the life and continuity of the community. These priestesses took vows of chastity that they were required to maintain for 30 years. To break this vow was considered the most heinous of crimes, an offense against the gods themselves, punishable by being buried alive. By forcing Rhea Silvia to become a Vestal virgin, Amulius ensured that she would never marry, never bear children, never produce an heir who might threaten his power. He believed he had secured his dynasty. Rhea Silvia accepted her fate with grace and resignation. She entered the temple of Vesta, donned the white robes of the priestesses, and assumed her duties. Her days became a pattern of ritual and service, rising before dawn to tend the sacred fire, making offerings to the goddess, participating in the ceremonies that marked the turning of the year. The temple was a place of quietude and order, far removed from the political intrigues of the palace. Here, in the flickering light of the eternal flame, Rhea Silvia might have found a kind of peace. But the gods had other plans. One day, as Rhea Silvia was drawing water from a sacred spring near the temple, the god Mars appeared to her. Mars, the god of war, the father of battle fury and military glory, was struck by the young priestess's beauty. In the ancient stories, the gods often desired mortal women, and what the gods desired, they took. The encounter between Mars and Rhea Silvia is shrouded in the mystery of the divine. Some accounts speak of force, others of seduction, others of a kind of divine inevitability that Rhea Silvia could not resist. What is certain is that from this union, Rhea Silvia became pregnant. The situation was catastrophic. A Vestal virgin carrying a child was an abomination, a violation of sacred law that threatened to bring down divine wrath upon Alba Longa. Yet Rhea Silvia could not reveal the true father of her child, for who would believe that Mars himself had visited her? She maintained her silence, and as her pregnancy became evident, horror and scandal swept through the city. When Amulius learned of Rhea Silvia's condition, he was filled with rage, not only at the violation of sacred law, but at the potential threat this represented to his power. Despite her claims that the father was Mars himself, he refused to believe her. In his eyes, she had broken her vows through some illicit affair, and she must be punished according to the law. Yet he hesitated to execute her immediately, perhaps restrained by some residual respect for her father Numitor, or perhaps waiting to see what kind of child she would bear. In the fullness of time, Rhea Silvia gave birth. But it was not to a single child. She bore twins, 2 boys who emerged into the world howling their defiance at fate. They were strong infants, vigorous and healthy, and even in their first moments of life, there was something remarkable about them, a vitality that seemed more than merely human. Amulius knew what he must do. These children, whether fathered by a god or a mortal, represented a potential threat to his throne. They were descendants of Numitor, with a claim to the kingship that some might consider superior to his own. The children could not be allowed to live. But Amulius was cunning enough to avoid the direct guilt of murder. Instead, he ordered that the infants be placed in a basket and cast into the Tiber River. The river would do his work for him, the babies would drown, and Amulius's hands would remain technically clean. As for Rhea Silvia, accounts differ. Some say she was executed for breaking her vows, buried alive according to the traditional punishment for errant Vestal Virgin. Others claim she was imprisoned, left to languish in darkness for the rest of her days. Still others whisper that Mars himself rescued her, taking her to live among the gods. The servant who was given the task of disposing of the twins carried them down to the Tiber. Perhaps he felt some compassion for the helpless infants. Perhaps he simply followed his orders with mechanical efficiency. He placed them in a makeshift basket. Some accounts say it was a wooden trough used for kneading bread. Others describe it as a woven basket lined with soft reeds. The babies were swaddled in cloth, and the servant set the basket gently on the water's surface. The Tiber had been flooding. Heavy rains in the mountains had swollen the river, and it ran high and fast, its waters brown with silt. The basket containing the twins was caught by the current and swept away, spinning slowly as it moved downstream. The servant watched until it disappeared from view, then returned to Alba Longa to report that the deed was done. But the gods were watching. The basket did not sink. Though the water rushed around it and waves splashed over its sides, somehow it remained afloat. It drifted downstream, past fields and forests, past villages where people went about their daily tasks, unaware of the extraordinary cargo passing by. The infants slept or cried as infants do, their voices lost in the sound of the rushing water. Eventually, as the flood waters began to recede, the basket became caught in the roots of a fig tree that grew on the riverbank. This was no ordinary fig tree. It was a Ficus ruminalis, a sacred tree associated with Rumina, the goddess who protected nursing mothers and infants. Here, in the shelter of this divine tree, at a place where the river had carved a shallow cave in the bank, the basket came to rest. The baby's cries attracted the attention of a creature who dwelt nearby. It was a she-wolf, a lupa, who had her den in the cave. She emerged from the shadows, drawn by the sound of distress, and discovered the basket with its tiny human cargo. The she-wolf approached cautiously, sniffing at the infants, assessing them with her keen senses. What happened next has echoed through history as one of the most powerful and enduring images of Rome, the she-wolf nursing the abandoned twins. Rather than seeing the infants as prey, the wolf's maternal instincts were somehow awakened. Perhaps the goddess Rumina herself intervened, or perhaps Mars guided his children's fate from Olympus. Whatever the reason, the she-wolf took the babies into her care. She pulled them from the basket with gentle teeth and carried them, one at a time, into the shelter of her cave. There, in the darkness warmed by her body and the bodies of her own cubs, she nursed the human infants alongside her wolf pups. Her milk sustained them, kept them alive, gave them strength. The she-wolf licked them clean, kept them warm, protected them from the dangers of the wild. Days passed, and the twins thrived in their unlikely nursery. They suckled at the wolf's teats, drawing nourishment from this fierce creature who had become their foster mother. The she-wolf was patient with them, tolerant of their human helplessness in a way that seems impossible, yet the ancient sources insist upon it. She became their guardian, their protector, the beast who stood between them and death. A woodpecker also joined in caring for the children, bringing them food. The woodpecker was sacred to Mars, and its presence confirmed the divine providence that watched over these infants. The bird perched on the edge of the basket, feeding the twins when the wolf was away hunting, another piece of evidence that the gods had marked these children for an extraordinary destiny. This strange nursery beneath the fig tree might have continued indefinitely, but fate had other plans. A shepherd named Faustulus, who tended his flocks in the area, happened to pass by the cave. He heard unusual sounds, the crying of human infants mixed with the growls and movements of wolves. Curious and concerned, he approached cautiously and discovered the remarkable scene. 2 human babies being nursed by a wild she-wolf. Faustulus was astonished, but he was also a practical man. He realized that these children, despite their divine protection, would not survive long in the wild. With a combination of courage and quick thinking, he managed to drive the she-wolf away and gather up the infants. The wolf did not fight him with her full ferocity, as if she understood that her task was complete, that the time had come for the children to return to human society. Faustulus carried the twins home to his wife, Acca Larentia. She was a kind woman, and though the couple was poor, they agreed to raise the foundlings as their own. They gave the boys names, Romulus and Remus. These names would become the most famous in Roman history, but at that moment they were simply 2 more mouths to feed in a shepherd's modest household. The image of the she-wolf nursing the twins became the foundational myth of Rome, captured in countless sculptures and paintings through the centuries. The most famous representation is the bronze statue that stands in the Capitoline museums, a she-wolf rendered in dark metal, her teats swollen with milk, her head turned to look back at the 2 human infants, reaching up to nurse from her. This image spoke to something deep in the Roman psyche. The idea that Rome was born of wildness and divinity, nurtured by the untamed forces of nature, marked from its very beginning as something extraordinary. The she-wolf represented both the ferocity and the nurturing spirit that Romans believed defined their civilization. She was wild, dangerous, capable of tearing apart any enemy, yet she showed mercy and maternal care to the helpless. She embodied the paradox of Rome itself, a city that would conquer through military might while also bringing order and civilization to the conquered, a culture that was simultaneously brutal and sophisticated. In the quiet darkness of the cave beneath the Ficus Ruminalis, 2 destinies had been preserved. The children who should have drowned, who should have perished in their first days of life, had survived through the intervention of gods and beasts. They had drunk wolf's milk, been warmed by wolf's fur, learned their first lessons from a creature of the wild. This beginning would shape everything that came after. the violence and the glory, the brotherhood and the betrayal, the founding of the city that would become the center of the world. But for now, they were simply Romulus and Remus, two boys growing up in a shepherd's hut, unaware of their true lineage, unknowing of the destiny that awaited them on the Palatine Hill. Chapter 3. The Shepherd Princes. Romulus and Remus grew up in the household of Faustulus and Acca Larentia, surrounded by the sights and sounds and smells of shepherd life. Their world was one of hillsides and flocks, of long days spent in the open air, watching over sheep and goats, of nights when the stars spread across the sky in glittering profusion, and the calls of wolves echoed from distant ridges. The boys showed from their earliest years that they were different from other children. They grew quickly, their bodies strong and vigorous, their movements marked by a grace and energy that seemed inexhaustible. While other children tired easily, Romulus and Remus could run for hours across the hills without showing fatigue. They climbed trees with the agility of squirrels, swam in the Tiber like otters, wrestled with each other in contests that often left both boys bruised but laughing. There was a wildness in them that Faustulus and Acca Larentia sometimes found difficult to manage. The twins were not disobedient or cruel, but they chafed at restrictions, constantly pushing at the boundaries of what was permitted. They wanted to explore every cave, climb every hill, investigate every dark forest grove. When they were supposed to be watching the sheep, they might instead be tracking a deer through the underbrush, or challenging each other to swim across the deepest part of the river, or building elaborate forts from fallen branches. Yet they were also fiercely loyal, both to each other and to their adoptive family. From the beginning, the bond between Romulus and Remus was absolute. They moved through the world as a unit, finishing each other's sentences, anticipating each other's actions, defending each other against any threat. If one was challenged, both fought. If one was praised, both beamed with pride. They were two halves of a single whole, inseparable and united. Faustulus watched them grow with a mixture of pride and puzzlement. He had never told them the full story of how he found them, never revealed the miracle of the she-wolf and the sacred fig tree. He simply raised them as his sons, teaching them the skills they would need to survive as shepherds in Latium. He showed them how to read the weather by watching the clouds, how to find water by following the flight of birds, how to deliver a lamb when the ewe was struggling with the birth. He taught them which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous, how to track animals by their spoor, how to build a fire even in the rain. The boys absorbed these lessons eagerly, but their interests extended beyond mere survival skills. They were natural leaders, and as they grew into adolescence, other young men from neighboring farms began to gather around them. Romulus and Remus organized the youths into bands that roamed the countryside, engaging in competitions and mock battles that tested strength and courage. These games sometimes grew rough, raids on rival groups, contests to see who could capture the most sheep from neighboring flocks, challenges that occasionally resulted in injuries. But there was also justice in how Romulus and Remus conducted themselves. When they took sheep from others, they distributed them to those in need. When they bested rivals in contests, they were generous in victory. They defended the weak against bullies, protected travelers from bandits, and showed mercy to defeated opponents. The local people began to speak of them with a mixture of admiration and wariness, these shepherd boys who carried themselves like princes. Faustulus heard these stories and grew uneasy. He saw how the twins were attracting attention, how their exploits were being discussed in the markets and taverns of the region. He began to worry that their growing fame might reach the ears of those in power, might draw dangerous scrutiny. And he knew that at some point he would have to tell them the truth about their origin. The revelation came, as these things often do, through a crisis. Remus and his companions were engaged in one of their raids, driving off cattle from the lands belonging to Numitor, the deposed king who still lived quietly on his estate near Alba Longa. Numitor's shepherds resisted, and in the ensuing scuffle, several of them were injured. Remus was captured and brought before Numitor to answer for the attack. Numitor looked at the young man standing before him with a strange sense of recognition. There was something in Remus's bearing, in the shape of his features, in the fire that burned in his eyes, that stirred memories. Numitor thought he had long buried. He questioned Remus closely. Where had he come from? Who were his parents? How old was he? Remus answered as best he could, but he knew little of his own history beyond what Faustulus had told him. Numitor's suspicions grew stronger. The timing was right. This young man would be approximately the same age as the twins born to his daughter Rhea Silvia, the twins that Amulius had ordered drowned in the Tiber. Could it be possible that they had survived? Meanwhile, Romulus learned of his brother's capture and immediately set out to rescue him. He gathered their companions and prepared to attack Numitor's estate, ready to fight however many men it took to free Remus. But Faustulus, seeing that events were spiraling beyond his control, finally revealed the truth. He told Romulus the story of how he had found the twins beneath the fig tree, being nursed by the she-wolf. He described the basket that had carried them down the flooding river, the evidence of their noble birth. He explained his suspicions about who their parents really were, that they were likely the twin sons of Rhea Silvia, grandsons of the deposed King Numitor, descendants of the great hero Aeneas himself. The revelation transformed everything. Romulus was stunned. His entire understanding of himself and his place in the world suddenly rewritten. He was not simply a shepherd's son. He was a prince, heir to a stolen throne, son of a Vestal virgin, and, if the stories were true, of the god Mars himself. Romulus went to his grandfather's estate, not as a raider, but as a grandson seeking recognition. The meeting between Numitor and the twins was emotional and profound. The old man looked into their faces and saw his daughter Rhea Silvia reflected there. He heard their story and recognized the hand of divine providence. These were his grandsons, saved by the gods, nurtured by a wolf, raised in exile but now returned. The truth spread quickly through the region. The twin grandsons of Numitor had survived, had been preserved by Mars and Rumina, had grown strong in the wilderness. Young men flocked to their banner, drawn by the romance of their story and the charisma of their personalities. Romulus and Remus found themselves at the head of a small army, composed of the shepherds and farmers who had been their companions, now joined by those who remained loyal to Numitor's cause. The twins turned their eyes toward Alba Longa and the usurper Amulius. Here was an opportunity not just for revenge, but for justice. To restore their grandfather to his rightful throne, to avenge their mother, Rhea Silvia, to claim their inheritance. The assault on Alba Longa was swift and decisive. Amulius, secure in his power for so many years, was unprepared for the sudden uprising. Romulus and Remus led their forces through the city gates, fighting their way toward the palace. The people of Alba Longa, many of whom had never accepted Amulius's rule, rose up to join them. What might have been a prolonged siege became instead a rapid revolution. Amulius fell, struck down by the twins themselves, according to some accounts, or killed by his own guards who switched allegiance at the crucial moment, according to others. Regardless of the exact details, the usurper's reign ended in blood and chaos. Numitor was restored to the throne of Alba Longa, welcomed by his people with celebrations that lasted for days. Romulus and Remus had accomplished what many would have thought impossible. They had overthrown a king, avenged their family, restored justice. They were heroes, celebrated throughout Latium. Their names were on everyone's lips. Young men sought to emulate them. Maidens composed songs about their exploits. They had proven themselves worthy of their divine heritage. But now a question arose. What would they do next? Numitor offered them positions of honor in Alba Longa. They could serve as his generals, his advisors, his heirs. They would want for nothing, live in comfort and luxury, eventually perhaps inherit the throne. But Romulus and Remus were restless. They had grown up in the open country, not in the confined spaces of a city. They had led free companions, not courtiers. The life of princes in an established kingdom, with its protocols and hierarchies and political intrigues, did not appeal to them. Something else called to them, a vision of creating something new, something that would be entirely their own. They thought of the place where Faustulus had found them, the hills beside the Tiber where they had spent their youth. That land was largely unsettled, claimed by no major city, ripe with possibility. There, they could build not just a new community, but a new kind of community, one that reflected their values and their vision. They approached Numitor with their plan. They would leave Alba Longa and found a new city on the Tiber. Numitor gave his blessing, perhaps relieved to solve the potential problem of having two ambitious grandsons competing for influence in his court. He provided them with resources, tools, livestock, grain for seed, and gave them permission to take with them anyone who wished to join their venture. Many did. The bands of young men who had followed Romulus and Remus in their adventures eagerly signed on for this new enterprise. Outlaws and refugees, people who had no place in the established order, saw in the twins' plan a chance for a fresh start. Shepherds and farmers who worked the lands near the 7 hills chose to align their fortunes with the brothers. A diverse group began to assemble, not the dignified founding population of legend, but a rough collection of the dispossessed, the ambitious, the adventurous, and the desperate. Romulus and Remus led their followers to the 7 hills beside the Tiber. They looked upon the landscape where they had been saved by the she-wolf, where they had grown from infants into men, and they saw in their mind's eye not what was, but what could be. Here they would build their city. Here they would create something that would last. But first, they needed to determine exactly where the city should be founded, and, more importantly, which brother would rule it. This was the moment when the perfect unity that had always existed between Romulus and Remus began to fracture. They were twin brothers, equal in strength and courage, equal in their claim to leadership. Both wanted to be king of the new city. Both believed they deserved the honor. The bond that had held them together since birth was about to be tested in a way that would determine not just their own fates, but the fate of the city they would create. The shepherd princes stood on the hills beside the Tiber, looking out over the land that would become Rome, unaware that the greatest challenge they would face was not external enemies or natural obstacles, but each other. Chapter 4. The Augury and the Choice. The sun rose over Latium, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, illuminating the 7 hills with gentle morning light. Romulus stood on the Palatine Hill, the highest and most defensible of the 7, looking out across the landscape. From this elevation, he could see the Tiber winding through the valley below, could see the other hills rising around him like a natural amphitheater, could see the distant mountains marking the horizon. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of dew-wet grass and wild herbs. Remus, meanwhile, had positioned himself on the Aventine Hill, another prominent elevation that overlooked the Tiber. From his vantage point, he could see much of the same landscape, but the perspective was different, the view encompassing different aspects of the terrain. The 2 brothers had chosen their positions deliberately, each claiming the hill they believed should be the center of the new city. The Palatine, with its steep sides and commanding height, seemed ideal for a fortified settlement. The Aventine, with its proximity to the river and its gentler approaches, offered different advantages. But this disagreement about location was really about something deeper, about who would rule, whose vision would prevail, whose name would be given to the city. They had decided to settle the matter through augury, the ancient practice of reading divine will through the observation of signs in nature, particularly the flight of birds. This was the method the Etruscans used to discern the favor of the gods, and it was considered the most authoritative way to resolve disputes when human judgment proved insufficient. Whichever brother received the more favorable sign would be recognized as the rightful king and founder of the new city. The ritual of augury was solemn and precise. Both brothers had purified themselves through fasting and ritual washing. They wore simple white robes and went bareheaded, humbling themselves before the powers they sought to consult. Each brother had with him several companions who would serve as witnesses, ensuring that the signs were interpreted honestly. The practice required patience and careful attention. The augur, in this case, each brother conducting his own observation, would define a templum, a sacred space in the sky marked out using a staff. Only the birds that flew through this templum would count. The augur would note the species of birds, the direction of their flight, their numbers, their behavior. Each detail carried meaning. Eagles were particularly significant, being the birds of Jupiter, king of the gods. Vultures, despite their association with death, were also considered highly auspicious, especially for matters of warfare and conquest. The direction from which birds flew, from the left or the right, indicated different types of divine favor or disfavor. Romulus stood motionless on the Palatine, his eyes scanning the sky, his mind focused on the sacred task. The morning air was still, and at first, no birds appeared. He waited, patient and alert, while the sun climbed higher and the shadows shortened. Around him, his companions also watched, understanding the gravity of the moment. On the Aventine, Remus maintained his own vigil, equally focused, equally determined. The two brothers, separated by a valley but united still in their competition, sought confirmation from the divine realm. Time passed. The sun grew warmer, and then movement in the sky, birds appearing in the east, their forms dark against the brightening heavens. Remus saw them first. 6 vultures, flying in formation, passing through his templum from an auspicious direction. His companions immediately began to shout, celebrating the sign. 6 vultures was a significant omen, a clear indication of divine favor. Messengers were dispatched immediately to carry the news to Romulus and to spread word among all the followers gathered in the valley below. Remus had received his sign. Surely this meant he was chosen by the gods to be king. But Romulus remained on the Palatine, still watching, still waiting. The celebration from the Aventine reached his ears, but he did not abandon his vigil. He maintained his focus, keeping his eyes on the sky, trusting that the gods had not yet finished speaking. And then, as the sun reached its zenith, a second group of birds appeared. 12 vultures this time, twice as many as had appeared to Remus, flying through Romulus's templum in a great wheeling flock. The dark shapes of the birds stood out clearly against the brilliant blue of the midday sky, their wings spread wide as they rode the thermal currents rising from the sun-warmed earth. Now it was Romulus's followers who erupted in cheers. 12 vultures, twice the number that had appeared to Remus. Clearly, this was the superior omen, the definitive sign that Romulus was destined to found and rule the city. Messengers ran to spread this news, creating confusion and conflicting claims throughout the gathering. The disagreement that had been submerged beneath the hope that augury would provide a clear answer now erupted with renewed force. Remus's supporters argued that their candidate had seen his birds first, that precedence in time mattered more than mere numbers. The gods had shown favor to Remus before they showed favor to Romulus. Therefore, Remus should be recognized as the chosen one. Romulus's supporters countered that the number of birds was clearly more significant. 12 vultures was an extraordinary omen, one that could not be matched by a mere 6. The gods had saved their most dramatic sign for last, showing definitively that Romulus was their chosen vessel. Both arguments had merit, and both sides believed passionately in their position. The followers of the two brothers began to cluster into opposing groups, hands moving toward weapons, voices rising in anger. The brotherhood that had united them in their adventures, in their overthrow of Romulus, in their journey to found a new city, was fracturing along fault lines of loyalty and ambition. Romulus and Remus themselves descended from their respective hills and met in the valley between them. The reunion of the brothers, who had been separated for only a few hours, was tense and awkward. Each tried to assert his claim without openly attacking the other. They had always been equals, always stood together, but now they were rivals, competitors for a prize that only one could possess. They argued, each presenting his case, each trying to convince the other to yield. The augury had not resolved the question, it had only intensified it. As the day wore on and the arguments continued, positions hardened. Neither brother was willing to concede. Neither was willing to serve under the other. The perfect unity that had characterized their relationship since birth was breaking apart, and neither seemed able or willing to repair it. Finally, unable to reach agreement, Romulus announced his decision. He would proceed with founding the city on the Palatine Hill under his authority, according to his vision. Those who wished to follow him were welcome. Those who preferred Remus could go with his brother. The partnership was dissolved. Remus felt the sting of rejection and dismissal. He and his supporters watched as Romulus began the ritual of founding the city. Using a bronze plow pulled by a white cow and a white bull, animals specially selected for their purity, Romulus traced the boundary of his new city around the Palatine Hill. This ritual, called the Sulcus Primigenius, or First Furrow, was sacred, marking the line between the civilized space within and the wild space without. Wherever gates would be, the plow was lifted and carried, leaving gaps in the furrow. But the furrow itself was inviolable, protected by divine sanction. To cross the plowed boundary, except at the designated gates, was to commit sacrilege. As Romulus performed this ritual, Remus watched with growing bitterness. The city was being founded, and he was being excluded from it. His twin brother, with whom he had shared everything, was proceeding without him, even in opposition to him. The followers of Remus jeered at Romulus's work, mocking the boundary he was creating, calling the line in the dirt a poor excuse for a fortification. What happened next is the darkest moment in Rome's founding story. The original sin that would haunt the city throughout its history. According to the traditional account, Remus, in an act of contempt and frustration, jumped over the newly plowed boundary of Romulus's city. Some versions say he did this mockingly, to demonstrate how easily the city could be breached. Others suggest he did it in a rage, openly defying his brother's authority. Still others imply he was merely careless, not understanding or caring about the sacred significance of what Romulus was doing. Whatever his motivation, the act was a profound violation. The boundary was sacred, protected by divine law. To leap over it was to disrespect not just Romulus, but the gods themselves, to treat as worthless what had been consecrated. Romulus's response was immediate and terrible. In a fury, whether from genuine religious outrage or from the accumulated frustrations of their conflict or from some darker impulse of jealousy and ambition, Romulus struck his brother down. Some accounts say Romulus killed Remus with his own hands, using a shovel or striking him with a rock. Others say that one of Romulus's followers, a man named Celer, committed the actual murder while Romulus watched. But the result was the same. Remus fell, his blood soaking into the earth of the Palatine Hill, his life ending at the hands of his twin brother. In that moment, in that single act of fratricidal violence, the city of Rome was born not in harmony, but in blood. The unity of the twins, the perfect brotherhood that had defined them, ended in murder. One brother lived to build his city, the other became its first victim, a sacrifice, intentional or not, to the ambitions that would drive Rome throughout its history. Romulus stood over his brother's body, and according to some accounts, he spoke words that would become famous. "So perish anyone who leaps over my walls." It was a declaration of the absolute sanctity of the city's boundaries, an assertion that Rome's integrity would be defended with ultimate force. But it was also a rationalization, an attempt to justify what had just happened as a necessary defense of sacred law, rather than as simple murder. The followers of both brothers stood in shocked silence. The playful raids and mock battles of their youth had ended in actual death. The competition that had seemed almost like a game had resulted in tragedy. Many of Remus's supporters, horrified by what had transpired, fled. Others, pragmatic or intimidated, chose to submit to Romulus's authority. The experiment in founding a new city had begun with the killing of one of its founders. Remus was buried with honors on the Aventine Hill, his body laid to rest on the height he had chosen. Funeral games were held, libations poured, and sacrifices made to ease his journey to the underworld. But the wound had been struck, and it would never fully heal. Rome would always carry the memory of its beginning, the knowledge that its foundation had required the death of one brother at the hands of another. Romulus continued with his founding. If he felt guilt or remorse, he did not show it publicly. He completed the ritual establishment of the city, sanctifying its boundaries, establishing its temples, creating its institutions. On April 21st, in a year that would later be calculated as 753 BCE, the city was officially founded. Romulus gave it a name derived from his own, Roma, Rome. The augury had not resolved the question cleanly. Instead, it had revealed that even the gods, it seemed, could send ambiguous messages, could fail to prevent tragic outcomes. Or perhaps the tragedy was itself part of the divine plan, a necessary bloodletting that established from the beginning what kind of city Rome would be, a city of absolute boundaries, of strict laws, of power that would not tolerate challenges, a city willing to sacrifice even what was most beloved for the sake of survival and glory. The sky above the Palatine Hill, which had been witness to the flight of 12 vultures, now looked down on a settlement taking shape. Wooden palisades were being erected along the line of the sacred furrow, transforming the plowed boundary into an actual fortification. Huts were being constructed using wattle and daub, their roofs thatched with straw. A shrine was built to Jupiter, king of the gods, on the summit of the hill. The work of creating a city had begun. But even as the hammers rang and the voices of workers filled the air, those who remembered looked toward the Aventine Hill, where Remus lay buried, and wondered what kind of future could be built on such a foundation. Chapter 5. The City Takes Root. The city of Rome, newly founded, was little more than a fortified village perched on the Palatine Hill. Wooden walls enclosed a modest area, perhaps no more than a square mile. Within these boundaries, rough huts clustered together, their thatched roofs offering basic shelter from rain and sun. Narrow paths wound between the dwellings, muddy when it rained, dusty when it was dry. There was no grand architecture, no marble temples, no paved streets. Rome in its infancy was crude and simple, a settlement that would have seemed unremarkable to any traveler passing through Latium. Yet despite its humble appearance, Rome had something that set it apart. Location. The 7 hills provided natural defenses. The Tiber offered water and a means of transportation and trade. The island in the river created a crossing point that linked the territories of the Latins, Sabines, and Etruscans. Salt routes from the coastal marshes passed nearby, bringing merchants and news from distant places. Rome sat at a nexus, a place where different peoples and different paths converged. Romulus understood that his city needed people to thrive. The initial population consisted of his followers, the shepherds and adventurers who had accompanied him from Alba Longa, the men who had stood with him during the overthrow of Amulius, the loyalists who had chosen him over Remus. But this group was predominantly male, young and rough. They were fighters and workers, not the foundation of a stable society. For Rome to grow beyond a military camp, it needed women, families, children. It needed diversity in age and skills. It needed to become a true community. Romulus addressed this need with characteristic pragmatism and boldness. He declared that Rome would be an asylum, a place of refuge for anyone seeking a fresh start. The city would welcome not just the respectable and the well-born, but also fugitives, slaves fleeing harsh masters, debtors escaping their creditors, criminals seeking amnesty, anyone who had reason to leave their former homes. No questions would be asked about past misdeeds. All who came to Rome and accepted its authority would be granted protection and the opportunity to begin anew. This was a radical policy. The established cities of Latium and Etruria were built on lineage and tradition, their citizenship carefully guarded, their populations stratified into ancient families with long genealogies. Rome, by contrast, offered a form of social mobility that was almost unheard of in the ancient world. A man's past didn't matter. Only his willingness to contribute to the new city's future counted. The policy worked. People came from throughout the region, drawn by the promise of acceptance and opportunity. They brought with them diverse skills: craftsmen who knew how to work metal and wood, farmers who understood how to cultivate the land, merchants familiar with trade routes, even priests who could perform the rituals necessary to secure divine favor. The population of Rome grew rapidly, a heterogeneous mixture that lacked the homogeneity of other cities but possessed instead a raw vitality and adaptability. But the policy also created a problem. The population remained heavily male. The men who came to Rome as refugees and asylum seekers rarely brought wives or daughters with them. The few women in the city were vastly outnumbered. Without women, without families, Rome's growth would be limited to a single generation. The city needed wives for its men, mothers for the next generation of Romans. Romulus attempted to solve this problem through diplomacy. He sent ambassadors to the neighboring tribes and cities, seeking to establish alliances through marriage. Roman men, he argued, would make excellent husbands. They were strong, hard-working, and citizens of a growing city with a promising future. But the response was consistently negative. The established communities looked down on Rome as a haven for outcasts and criminals. They had no interest in mixing their bloodlines with such people, no matter how promising the city's location might be. One after another, the requests for intermarriage were rejected, often with scorn. The rejections angered the Romans, but more than that, they created a sense of desperation. The city needed women, and diplomatic means had failed. What other options remained? Romulus conceived a plan, one that was audacious and morally questionable, but which he believed necessary for Rome's survival. He would host a great festival and invite all the neighboring peoples to attend. Then, during the festivities, the Roman men would seize the unmarried women from among the guests and claim them as wives. The plan was calculated to minimize violence while achieving its objective. The women would be taken, but not harmed. They would be treated with respect and honor once they were in Roman homes. Romulus hoped that once the initial shock wore off, the women would accept their new situations and the neighboring peoples would eventually acquiesce to the fait accompli, rather than risk war over what was already done. In the late summer, Rome announced a grand festival in honor of Consus, the god of grain storage and the autumn harvest. The celebrations would include athletic competitions, horse races, theatrical performances, and abundant food and wine. All the neighboring peoples were invited to attend. The Sabines, the Caeninenses, the Antemnatis, the Crustumerians, and others from throughout Latium. The invitation emphasized the desire for peace and friendship, for Rome to take its place as a good neighbor among the communities of the region. Many came, curious about this new city and attracted by the promise of entertainment and feasting. They came as families, men, women, and children, dressed in their finest clothes, bringing gifts and expectations of a pleasant celebration. The Sabines in particular arrived in large numbers, including many unmarried daughters. Rome had been prepared for the guests. Temporary amphitheater-style seating had been constructed in a valley between the hills. Food had been gathered and prepared. Games and races had been organized. The Romans welcomed their guests with apparent sincerity and hospitality, showing them the sights of the new city, sharing food and drink, engaging in friendly conversation. The festival began. Athletes competed in foot races and wrestling matches. Horses thundered around a rough track, their riders urging them forward while spectators cheered. Music played and dancers performed. Wine flowed freely. The atmosphere was festive, relaxed. The guests began to feel comfortable, their initial wariness fading. Then, at a prearranged signal from Romulus, accounts differ on whether it was a trumpet blast or the raising of his cloak or some other sign, the Roman men sprang into action. They rushed among the crowd, seizing the unmarried women, pulling them away from their families. The celebration erupted into chaos and screaming. The Roman men had been instructed clearly about their conduct. They were not to harm the women or to seize married women or children. Their targets were specifically the unmarried young women of childbearing age. And despite the violence of the abduction, the Romans exercised relative restraint. They pushed aside resisting fathers and brothers, but they did not kill. They grabbed and carried off struggling women, but they did not rape or beat them. The male guests, outraged and overwhelmed, tried to fight back, but they were unprepared and outnumbered. Many fled, leaving their daughters and sisters behind. Others fought briefly before being driven off. Some fathers and brothers refused to leave without their women, and these were forcibly ejected from the city. Within a short time, order was restored. Roman order. The city's gates were closed, the walls manned. Rome had acquired what it needed. Several hundred women who would become the mothers of the next generation of Romans. The women who had been seized were terrified and furious. They had come as honored guests and had been treated as plunder. They mourned their families, feared what would happen to them, and burned with anger at the betrayal. But Romulus had prepared for this as well. He visited the captured women personally, addressing them as a group, and made a careful speech. He acknowledged the wrong that had been done to them, but he asked them to understand the desperation that had driven Rome to such measures. The city needed them, he said, not as slaves, but as honored wives, as mothers of Roman children, as equal partners in building something great. He promised that they would be treated with respect, that their husbands would honor them, that they would have rights and status in Rome equal to any free-born Roman woman. He appealed to their reason, their compassion, and their self-interest. Each Roman man who had seized a woman now came forward to claim her officially as his bride. In most cases, these men were earnest in their intentions. They had not seized these women out of cruel lust, but out of genuine need for wives. They spoke to their captive brides, making promises, trying to comfort, attempting to transform an act of violence into the beginning of a marriage. Gradually, over days and weeks, some of the women began to accept their situation. They realized that escape was impossible, that their former communities had not come to rescue them, that their futures now lay in Rome. Some even began to see advantages in their new circumstances. They would be founding mothers of a new city, partners in an ambitious enterprise. Their children would be Romans, citizens of a growing power. The men who had seized them were young and vigorous, and many proved attentive and respectful as husbands. Not all the women accepted willingly. Some remained bitter and resentful, never forgiving the violation, but many did adapt, and some even came to love their Roman husbands. Human beings are remarkably resilient and adaptable, capable of finding meaning and building relationships even in difficult circumstances. But while the women were gradually adjusting to their new lives, their families and communities were responding with rage to the outrage. The rape of the Sabine. Women, as this event would come to be known in history, had violated every code of hospitality and honor. The Sabines in particular, who had lost the most women, burned for revenge. War was inevitable. The Sabine king, Titus Tatius, assembled an army and marched on Rome. Other neighboring communities, the Caninenses, the Antemnates, the Crustumerians, also prepared for war, outraged by Roman treachery. Rome, which had hoped to secure its future through marriage, now faced the prospect of annihilation through military defeat. But Rome's location offered defensive advantages. The walls, simple as they were, made assault difficult. The hills provided elevated positions for defenders. The Tiber protected one flank. Romulus proved himself a capable military commander, organizing the defense, rallying his men with speeches that reminded them they were fighting for their homes, their wives, their very survival. The first attacks came from the Caninenses. Romulus led a sortie out of the city and defeated them in open combat, killing their king Acron in single combat. The surviving Caninenses retreated, and Romulus returned to Rome in triumph, carrying the arms and armor of the defeated king. The first spolia opima, the rich spoils taken from an enemy commander killed in single combat by the Roman commander. It was a victory that established Romulus's reputation as a warrior. The Antemnates and Crustumerians attacked next, also unsuccessfully. Romulus defeated them in turn, incorporating the defeated populations into Rome, expanding the city's territory and adding to its manpower. This pattern of defeating enemies and then absorbing them, turning former foes into Romans, would become a hallmark of Roman expansion throughout history. But the Sabines were more formidable. Titus Tatius commanded a larger army and was determined to recover his people's daughters or die trying. The Sabines besieged Rome, and Romulus found himself facing the most serious threat to his young city. The siege dragged on. Both sides suffered casualties, but neither could gain a decisive advantage. The Sabines could not breach Rome's walls, and Romulus could not defeat the Sabines in the field. The conflict seemed likely to continue until one side or the other was exhausted. Then something unexpected happened. The Sabine women, the same women who had been seized during the festival, who had been the cause of the war, intervened. Chapter 6. The Women's Peace. The war between Rome and the Sabines had reached a critical moment. Both armies had assembled on an open field between the hills, preparing for what would likely be a decisive battle. Banners snapped in the wind, armor glinted in the sunlight, and the air was thick with tension. Thousands of men stood ready to kill and die, driven by honor, anger, and the momentum of conflict. Then, from the gates of Rome, a group emerged that neither army expected: the Sabine women. They came running across the field, heedless of the danger, placing themselves directly between the two armies. They were led by Hercilia, wife of Romulus himself, who had come to understand and even support her husband's vision for the city. But she was joined by many others, women who had been seized during the festival, who had spent months living in Rome, who had become wives, and many of whom were now mothers or pregnant with their first children. These women had changed. They were no longer simply Sabine daughters. They had become something new. They were Roman wives, mothers of Roman children, but they still loved their Sabine fathers and brothers. The war threatened to make them choose between two loyalties, to force them to accept the death of either their natal families or their new families. It was a choice they refused to make. Hercilia raised her voice so that both armies could hear. She spoke of the pain and confusion the women had experienced, of the fear and anger they had felt when they were first taken. But she also spoke of what had come after, how their Roman husbands had treated them with honor and respect, how they had built homes and begun to build lives together. She spoke as a mother, holding her infant child, Romulus's daughter, in her arms, and she asked a simple question. What kind of world would this child inherit if the men of both sides slaughtered each other today? Other women joined their voices to hers, some weeping, some shouting, all pleading for the fighting to stop. They called out to their fathers and brothers in the Sabine ranks, begging them not to kill their husbands. They turned to their Roman husbands and begged them not to kill their fathers. They held up their children, the grandchildren of Sabines, the sons and daughters of Romans, and asked both sides whether they wanted these infants to grow up as orphans, whether honor was worth more than family. The spectacle was extraordinary. Warriors preparing for battle found themselves confronted not with enemy soldiers, but with their own daughters and sisters, now transformed into wives and mothers of their enemies. The clear lines of conflict became blurred, complicated by bonds of kinship and love that crossed the battle lines. Titus Tatius, the Sabine king, looked across the field and saw his daughter among the women. She held a baby, his grandchild, half Roman, half Sabine. He had come to avenge her abduction, to punish Rome for its crime against his family and his people. But now she was asking him not to fight, not to kill her husband, not to make her child fatherless. The simple righteousness of his cause suddenly became tangled with complexities he had not anticipated. Romulus, too, was confronted with the weight of the moment. His wife Hercilia stood before him, their child in her arms, asking him to find another way. He had founded Rome through violence, through the killing of his brother, through the seizure of these women, through warfare with his neighbors. At every turn, force had been his answer, but now the women were offering a different path, one that required not strength of arms, but strength of character, the ability to compromise, to forgive, to build peace where war seemed inevitable. The moment hung suspended, balanced on the edge of decision. Then, almost simultaneously, both commanders lowered their weapons. Titus Tatius called for his men to hold. Romulus ordered his Romans to stand down. The tension that had been building toward the violent release instead began to dissipate. Representatives from both sides met in the space between the armies, with the women present as witnesses and mediators. The negotiations that followed were pragmatic and innovative. Rather than accepting defeat or demanding unconditional surrender, both sides agreed to an unprecedented arrangement. Rome and the Sabines would merge into a single people. The city would be jointly ruled by Romulus and Titus Tatius as co-kings. The combined population would be called Romans, but the city's tribes would bear Sabine names, honoring the women and their people. Citizens from both nations would share equal rights and privileges. It was a remarkable compromise, born from an impossible situation. The Sabine women had, through their intervention, transformed a zero-sum conflict into a solution where both sides gained. Rome more than doubled its population overnight, gaining experienced warriors, skilled craftsmen, and established families. The Sabines regained their daughters and gained a stake in the rising city's future. The women themselves gained status and security, no longer simply captives, but honored as peacemakers and as the living bridges between two peoples. The treaty was sealed with sacrifices and solemn oaths. The two armies, which had been preparing to slaughter each other, instead mingled peacefully, sharing food and wine, beginning the process of getting to know their new compatriots. Sabine families were reunited with their daughters, meeting their sons-in-law and grandchildren for the first time. Roman men met their wives' families, transforming abstract enemies into concrete individuals with names and faces. The physical city expanded to accommodate the new population. The Sabines settled primarily on the Quirinal and Capitoline hills, while the original Romans maintained their homes on the Palatine. The areas between the hills began to be developed, creating a more interconnected settlement. New temples were built, honoring both Roman and Sabine deities. The Forum, the open space that would become the heart of Roman civic life, began to take shape in the valley between the hills, serving as a marketplace and meeting ground where the newly merged peoples could interact. The joint kingship of Romulus and Titus Tatius worked remarkably well, at least initially. The two men divided responsibilities, with Romulus focusing primarily on military matters and Titus Tatius handling much of the civil administration. They consulted on major decisions and generally found ways to accommodate each other's perspectives. Their cooperation set a tone that helped the Roman and Sabine populations integrate more smoothly than might otherwise have been possible. But the peace was not without tensions. Cultural differences created friction. Religious practices didn't always align perfectly. Disputes arose about property boundaries and resource allocation. Some Sabines never fully accepted their incorporation into Rome, and some Romans resented having to share power and status with former enemies. 5 years after the merger, Titus Tatius was killed during a religious festival in the nearby city of Lavinium. The circumstances were murky. Some accounts suggest he was assassinated by relatives of some Latins he had wronged. Others hint at Roman involvement, or at least Roman indifference to his fate. Romulus did not pursue vengeance vigorously, which some interpreted as tacit approval of the killing. Whether by design or by chance, the joint kingship came to an end. and Romulus became sole ruler of Rome once again. Despite Titus Tatius's death, the merger of Romans and Sabines persisted. The peoples had become too intertwined to separate. Intermarriage had created kinship bonds throughout the population. Children born after the merger identified simply as Romans, with mixed heritage that was becoming increasingly common. The city's institutions incorporated elements from both traditions. Rome had truly become a new thing, not simply Latin or Sabine, but Roman, a synthesis that was greater than either component. Romulus continued to rule for many more years. Under his leadership, Rome grew in size, strength, and reputation. He organized the population into units for military and civil purposes, creating the foundation of the Roman system of tribes and centuries. He established the Senate, an advisory council of elders who represented the leading families, both the original Romans and the incorporated Sabines and others. He codified laws and customs, creating the framework of Roman governance that would persist, with modifications, for centuries. The king also continued Rome's policy of warfare and expansion. He fought against the Etruscans to the north, against various Latin communities, against the Fidenites and others. More often than not, Rome was victorious, and each victory brought new territory and new people into the growing city's orbit. The pattern established with the Sabines repeated. Defeated enemies were often offered the opportunity to become Romans, to join the city rather than be destroyed by it. This policy of incorporation, of turning enemies into citizens, gave Rome a capacity for growth that few other ancient cities possessed. But there was a darkness that lingered over Romulus's reign, a shadow cast by the blood that had marked Rome's founding. The memory of Remus could not be fully suppressed. Some whispered that the city was cursed, that fratricide could never bring true legitimacy, that divine justice would eventually come for Romulus. The king himself seemed haunted at times, especially as he grew older, by the ghost of the brother he had killed. As Romulus aged, his rule became more autocratic. The vigor and charisma of his youth hardened into something more authoritarian. He relied less on the Senate and more on his own judgment. Some senators began to feel that he had outlived his usefulness, that the city he had founded now needed different leadership for the next phase of its development. The end of Romulus's reign came suddenly and mysteriously. According to the official account, a tremendous storm arose one day while Romulus was reviewing his troops on the Campus Martius, the field of Mars. Dark clouds gathered, thunder rolled across the sky, and such torrential rain fell that visibility dropped to almost nothing. When the storm cleared, Romulus had vanished. He was never seen again. The official explanation, promoted by priests and senators, was that Mars had reclaimed his son, that Romulus had been taken up into the heavens and transformed into the god Quirinus. He had ascended to Olympus, they said, to take his place among the immortal gods, watching over the city he had founded. Some claimed to have witnessed the apotheosis, describing how Romulus had been enveloped in a glowing cloud and lifted toward the sky. But there were darker rumors, whispered in the streets and taverns, that never entirely disappeared. These rumors suggested that the senators, tired of Romulus's increasingly authoritarian rule, had used the cover of the storm to murder him. They had dismembered his body, it was said, and each senator had hidden a piece beneath his robes, carrying it out of the Campus Martius and disposing of it so that no trace of the killing could be found. The story of divine apotheosis was a convenient fiction, a cover-up to prevent civil unrest and to preserve the legitimacy of Rome's institutions. Whether Romulus ascended to heaven or was murdered by the Senate, his era had ended. The founder was gone. The city he had built would have to continue without him. Rome mourned its first king, organizing elaborate funeral games even though there was no body to bury. Sacrifices were made, prayers offered, and Romulus was honored as a god, with a temple dedicated to him as Quirinus, built on the Quirinal Hill. Young men joined the priesthood that served his cult, maintaining the rituals that would keep his memory alive. But even as Rome honored its founder, the city moved forward. The Senate, the people, and the institutions Romulus had created would prove to be his most enduring legacy, more lasting than any temple, more significant than any individual achievement. Rome had begun as the vision of one man, but it had grown into something larger, something that would outlive any individual ruler. The city on the 7 hills, born in myth and blood, nurtured by wolves and women, would continue its journey through history. The age of kings was not yet over. There would be 6 more kings after Romulus, each adding their own contributions to Rome's development. But the foundational work was done. The city existed, its character established, its destiny set in motion. Chapter 7. The Kings Who Followed. After Romulus disappeared in the storm, whether to heaven or to the Senate's blades, Rome faced its first succession crisis. The city was still young, its institutions untested, its population a mixture of peoples with different traditions and loyalties. How would a new king be chosen? Would the Roman element prevail, or the Sabine? Would there be civil war, or could a peaceful transition be managed? The Senate took control of the interregnum, the period between kings. They devised a system where the senators would take turns exercising royal authority, each serving for 5 days before passing the power to the next. This arrangement prevented any single faction from seizing permanent control while allowing time for consensus to emerge about who the next king should be. After a year of this rotating authority, the Senate finally reached agreement. The new king would be Numa Pompilius, a Sabine who lived in the nearby town of Cures. Numa had a reputation for wisdom, piety, and justice. He was not a warrior like Romulus, but rather a contemplative man, devoted to religious observances and philosophical reflection. His selection represented a deliberate choice to balance Rome's character. After the militarism and violence of Romulus's reign, the city would have a period focused on peace, religion, and the development of civil institutions. Numa initially resisted the call to kingship. He was content with his quiet life, spending his days in study and religious devotion. But delegations from Rome persisted, and eventually he accepted the honor, traveling to Rome and being formally inaugurated as its second king. Numa's reign, which lasted 43 years according to tradition, was marked by an almost complete absence of warfare. Instead of expanding Rome's territory through conquest, Numa focused on building the city's spiritual and institutional foundations. He reorganized the religious calendar, establishing the 12 months that would structure the Roman year. He founded colleges of priests to oversee different aspects of religious observance, the augurs who read divine will through bird flight and other signs, the flamens who served specific deities, the vestals who tended the sacred fire. Numa also established many of Rome's temples, creating proper houses for the gods who protected the city. He founded the Temple of Janus, the two-faced god who looked both forward and backward, whose doors remained open during times of war and closed during peace. Throughout Numa's reign, those doors stayed closed, a testament to the tranquility he maintained. The king claimed to receive guidance from the nymph Egeria, who met with him in a sacred grove outside the city. Whether Egeria was a real divine being, a metaphor for Numa's own wisdom, or a political fiction to lend authority to his religious reforms, her counsel was said to shape many of his decisions. In the quiet of the grove, beside the spring where Egeria dwelt, Numa would contemplate the needs of his city and the will of the gods. Under Numa's leadership, Rome transformed from a rough military camp into a more sophisticated city with established customs and religious observances. The random violence that had characterized the city's early years gave way to legal procedures and ritual protocols. Property rights were defined and protected. Trade was regulated. The calendar provided a framework for civic life, with certain days designated for religious observance, others for commerce, others for judicial proceedings. When Numa died peacefully at an advanced age, Rome had been fundamentally changed. The city had learned that it could achieve greatness through means other than warfare, that strength could come from unity and piety as well as from military might. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, would swing the pendulum back toward militarism, but Numa's contributions remained, providing a spiritual and institutional foundation that would persist throughout Rome's history. Tullus Hostilius was chosen as Rome's third king, specifically because he represented qualities opposite to Numa's. Where Numa had been peaceful, Tullus was warlike. Where Numa had been contemplative, Tullus was active and aggressive. Rome's population, especially its younger generation, had grown restless during the long peace. They yearned for glory, for conquest, for the excitement of military campaigns. Tullus gave them what they wanted. His reign was marked by almost constant warfare. He provoked conflicts with Alba Longa, the mother city from which Romulus and Remus had come. The war between Rome and Alba Longa was notable for the legendary combat of the Horatii and Curiatii, three brothers from each city who fought as champions to determine the outcome without the need for full-scale battle. The Roman Horatii prevailed, and Alba Longa was subsequently destroyed, its population forcibly relocated to Rome. The integration of Alba Longa's people significantly increased Rome's size and strength. Tullus also fought against the Sabines, the Fidenates, and the Veientes, expanding Roman territory and influence. But his relentless focus on warfare came at a cost. According to tradition, Tullus neglected religious observances, believing that devotion to Mars, the god of war, was sufficient. This impiety allegedly brought divine disfavor. A plague struck Rome, killing many, and Tullus himself became ill. When he finally attempted to perform the religious rituals he had long neglected, he made errors in the complicated procedures. Jupiter, angered by the impiety and incompetence, struck Tullus's house with lightning, burning it and the king within. The fourth king, Ancus Marcius, was Numa's grandson through his mother, and he attempted to combine the best qualities of both his predecessors, Numa's piety and Tullus's military vigor. Ancus renewed Rome's religious institutions, which had been neglected during Tullus's reign, while also conducting successful military campaigns against the Latins. He extended Rome's territory to the sea, founding the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber, opening new possibilities for trade and contact with the wider Mediterranean world. Ancus also focused on infrastructure, building Rome's first aqueduct to provide fresh water to the growing city, constructing the first bridge across the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius, and fortifying the Janiculum Hill to protect Rome's western approaches. These practical achievements improved the quality of life for ordinary Romans and demonstrated that kingship could serve the people's needs in mundane but important ways. The fifth king, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, was an outsider, an Etruscan who had migrated to Rome seeking opportunities. His original name was Lucumo, and he came from Tarquinii in Etruria with his wife Tanaquil, a woman renowned for her wisdom and skill at prophecy. Despite being a foreigner, Tarquinius gained the favor of Ancus Marcius and eventually succeeded him as king, a testament to Rome's continuing willingness to incorporate newcomers into its highest ranks. Tarquinius brought Etruscan sophistication to Rome. He began the construction of great public works that would transform the city's appearance. The most significant was the temple to Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, a massive structure that would become the symbolic heart of Rome. He also initiated the draining of the valley between the Palatine and Capitoline Hills, creating the space that would become the Roman Forum, the center of political, religious, and commercial life. Under Tarquinius, Rome began to look less like a large village and more like a proper city. Stone gradually replaced wood in important structures. Streets were laid out with more planning. The Circus Maximus was established for chariot races and public games. Etruscan artisans and engineers brought new skills and aesthetic sensibilities. The city started to display some of the grandeur that would eventually characterize imperial Rome. Tarquinius was murdered after 38 years of rule, struck down by the sons of Ancus Marcius, who felt they had been cheated of their rightful inheritance. But his widow Tanaquil managed the succession brilliantly, concealing his death until she could secure the throne for Servius Tullius, Tarquinius's son-in-law. Servius Tullius, the sixth king, was a remarkable figure. According to legend, he was born to a slave woman in the royal household, and his head was observed to be surrounded by flames while he slept as an infant, a sign of divine favor. Despite his humble origins, or perhaps because of them, Servius became one of Rome's greatest reformers. Servius reorganized the Roman population according to wealth rather than birth, creating a new system of classes based on property. This Servian constitution, as it came to be known, determined each citizen's military obligations and voting rights according to their economic status. The wealthiest citizens, who could afford the best armor and weapons, formed the first class and had the most political power. Poorer citizens served in less heavily equipped units and had correspondingly less influence. This system tied political rights to military service and economic contribution, creating a framework that would shape Roman politics for centuries. Servius also expanded Rome's physical boundaries dramatically, constructing a new wall that enclosed all 7 hills and the areas between them. The Servian Wall, parts of which still exist today, was a massive undertaking demonstrating Rome's growing wealth and organizational capacity. The enclosed area was huge compared to the original settlement on the Palatine. Rome had truly become a major city, but Servius's reign ended tragically. His daughter Tullia was married to Tarquinius's son, another Lucius Tarquinius, an ambitious and ruthless man who grew impatient waiting for the throne. Tullia was equally ambitious, urging her husband to seize power. Together, they engineered a coup. Tarquinius entered the Senate house and seated himself on the king's throne, claiming authority. When Servius came to confront him, Tarquinius physically threw the old king down the Senate house steps. As Servius lay injured in the street, Tullia drove her carriage over his body, crushing her own father to death in her eagerness to see her husband crowned. This Tarquinius, who became known as Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, would be Rome's 7th and final king. His reign was marked by tyranny and cruelty. He ruled without consulting the Senate, used violence to intimidate opposition, and executed or exiled potential rivals. He continued the tradition of grand building projects, completing the Temple of Jupiter that his father had begun. But he financed these works through heavy taxation and forced labor that made him increasingly unpopular. The end of the monarchy came not through military defeat or political maneuvering, but through a crime that outraged Roman sensibilities. Tarquin's son, Sextus Tarquinius, raped Lucretia, the virtuous wife of a Roman nobleman named Collatinus. Lucretia, though innocent, felt so dishonored that she summoned her father and husband, revealed what had been done to her, and then stabbed herself to death before them. Her death became a rallying point for all the accumulated grievances against the Tarquin family. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, a relative of the king who had pretended to be simple-minded to avoid assassination, a rebellion erupted. Brutus displayed Lucretia's body in the Forum, denouncing the Tarquins and calling for their expulsion. The people in the army turned against the royal family. Tarquin Superbus and his family fled Rome, never to return. In 509 BCE, if we can trust the traditional chronology, the Roman monarchy ended. The city that had been ruled by kings for 2.5 centuries would now try something different, something unprecedented. Rather than seeking a new king, Rome would become a republic, ruled by annually elected magistrates and guided by the Senate. The age of kings was over. The age of the republic was beginning, As the citizens gathered in the Forum to declare their new form of government, they might have reflected on the strange path that had brought them to this moment. From mythical twins nursed by a wolf, through fratricide and the rape of the Sabine women, through wars and peace, through wise kings and tyrants, Rome had grown from nothing into a major power. The city that should never have existed, founded by refugees and outcasts, born in blood and treachery, had nevertheless thrived. The founding myths had shaped Roman identity in profound ways. The story of Romulus and Remus taught that Rome was special, marked by divine favor despite its violent origins. The she-wolf symbolized both ferocity and nurturing care, qualities Romans aspired to embody. The rape of the Sabine women and the subsequent peace demonstrated that Rome could transform enemies into citizens, that the city had an almost infinite capacity for incorporation and growth. The succession of kings showed that leadership could take many forms: military, religious, constitutional, and that Rome could adapt to changing needs. As the sun set over the 7 hills on the last day of the monarchy, Rome stood transformed from the simple settlement Romulus had founded. The city's walls enclosed a large area filled with tens of thousands of people. The Forum bustled with commerce and political debate. Temples to numerous gods dotted the hills. Roads connected Rome to other cities throughout Latium. The city had become the dominant power in the region, respected and feared by its neighbors. But Rome was still small by the standards of the Mediterranean world. The great Etruscan cities to the north were more sophisticated. The Greek colonies in southern Italy possessed superior culture and philosophy. Carthage, the Phoenician city in North Africa, commanded vast wealth and naval power. Persia ruled an empire that stretched from India to Egypt. Rome was a provincial power, significant in its local context but unknown to most of the civilized world. No one, watching the Romans establish their new republic in 509 BCE, could have predicted what would come next. No one could have foreseen that this city, founded in legend and nurtured through struggle, would eventually conquer the entire Mediterranean world, would rule an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, would create a civilization whose influence would extend through millennia. But the seeds of that future greatness had been planted in the mythical past, in the stories of Romulus and Remus, in the she-wolf's care, in the courage of the Sabine women, in the varied achievements of the 7 kings. Rome's founding myths were not simply entertaining stories. They were the genetic code of a civilization, containing within them the values, ambitions, and contradictions that would shape everything that followed. Chapter 8: The Legacy of Legend. The myths of Rome's founding took on lives of their own, evolving and deepening as the centuries passed. Each generation of Romans revisited these stories, finding in them new meanings relevant to their own times, using them to justify actions, to inspire courage, to explain their place in the world. The image of the she-wolf nursing Romulus and Remus became the most enduring symbol of Rome. Artists across the ancient world created countless representations. The famous bronze statue in the Capitoline museums, which may date to Etruscan times, became an icon recognized throughout the empire. Images of the wolf and twins appeared on coins, in mosaics, painted on walls, carved into stone. Even today, more than 2,000 years after Rome's founding, this image remains immediately recognizable, a symbol of the city that needs no explanation. But what did the she-wolf represent to the Romans themselves? On one level, it was simply a miraculous story, evidence of divine favor for their city. Yet on a deeper level, the wolf symbolized the essential character Romans believed they possessed. The wolf was fierce, powerful, capable of terrible violence, but also loyal to her pack, protective of the vulnerable, willing to adopt and nurture even those not her own. Romans saw themselves in this light. Yes, they were conquerors, brutal when necessary, feared by their enemies. But they were also builders of civilization, bringers of order, protectors of those who accepted Roman authority. The duality of the wolf, savage yet maternal, wild yet devoted, captured something essential about how Romans understood their own nature. They were not gentle philosophers like the Greeks, not contemplative mystics like some Eastern peoples. They were practical, fierce, and uncompromising. But they also valued family, loyalty, and the bonds of citizenship. The wolf embodied this paradox perfectly. The story of Romulus and Remus, and particularly the fratricide that concluded it, was more troubling. How could a city claim greatness when its very foundation required one brother to murder another? Roman writers and philosophers wrestled with this question throughout their history. Some emphasized that Remus had committed sacrilege by violating the sacred boundary, and that Romulus had been justified in defending the sanctity of the city's borders. This interpretation made the fratricide a necessary act, a demonstration that Rome's laws and boundaries were inviolable, protected even against the founder's own brother. It suggested that Rome's strength came from placing the community's interests above personal relationships, no matter how painful that might be. Others saw in the story a warning about the dangers of ambition and competition. The tragedy of Romulus and Remus showed how the quest for power could destroy even the closest bonds. It was a cautionary tale about the need for compromise, for finding ways to share authority rather than insisting on absolute rule. Still others interpreted the fratricide as Rome's original sin, a stain that could never be fully cleansed. The blood of Remus had soaked into the Palatine Hill, and that blood would call out for more blood throughout Roman history. The civil wars that periodically tore Rome apart, the assassinations and betrayals that marked its political life, the violence that seemed endemic to Roman culture, all of this could be traced back to that first fratricidal act. Rome was a city built on bloodshed, and bloodshed would always be part of its character. The rape of the Sabine women presented different challenges for later Romans. On the surface, it was a story of violence against women, of betrayal and violation. Yet it was also a foundational moment for Rome, the event that provided the city with the women it needed to grow. That eventually led to the merging of Romans and Sabines into a stronger, united people. Roman writers tended to emphasize the relatively respectful treatment the women received after their abduction, the fact that they became honored wives rather than slaves or concubines. the crucial role they played in making peace between the warring parties. The story became less about the violence of the abduction and more about the agency of the women in shaping Rome's future, about their transformation from victims into founders, from foreign captives into Roman matrons. The Sabine women in this reading demonstrated female virtue and wisdom. They recognized that revenge and warfare would only lead to more suffering. They chose instead to embrace their new roles, to build bridges between communities, to create peace through their own decisions and actions. They became models for how Roman women should behave: practical, courageous, devoted to family, willing to put the good of the community above personal grievances. Of course, this interpretation glossed over the trauma of the original abduction, the lack of choice the women initially had, the violence done to them and their families. But myths serve the needs of the societies that tell them, and Rome needed to believe that its founding, despite its violence, had ultimately led to something good. The 7 kings who followed Romulus provided a kind of template for different styles of leadership. Numa represented religious devotion and peacetime governance. Tullus Hostilius embodied military aggression and conquest. Ancus Marcius showed the value of infrastructure and practical improvements. Tarquinius Priscus brought cultural sophistication and grand ambitions. Servius Tullius demonstrated the possibility of social reform and merit-based advancement. Tarquinius Superbus served as a warning about tyranny and the abuse of power. Romans could look at these 7 kings and see the full spectrum of governance, the various ways power could be exercised, the different priorities a leader might emphasize. The kings also showed that Rome could absorb foreign rulers. Both Tarquins were Etruscan, yet they became Roman kings, demonstrating again the city's remarkable capacity to incorporate diverse elements into a unified whole. The transition from monarchy to republic became another foundational story. Lucretia's rape and suicide, Brutus's rallying cry, the expulsion of the Tarquins. These events were remembered as the second founding of Rome, a moment when the city chose liberty over tyranny, when the people asserted their right to govern themselves rather than submit to royal authority. The republic that emerged from the monarchy's fall would last for nearly 500 years, far longer than the monarchical period. During those centuries, Rome would conquer Italy, defeat Carthage, subjugate Greece, expand into Gaul and Spain and Egypt and beyond. The Republic would survive crises that should have destroyed it, would demonstrate a resilience and adaptability that astonished the ancient world. Yet the Republic would also be torn apart by civil wars, would struggle with the very success it achieved, would ultimately collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. From the Republic's ruins would emerge the Empire, a return to one-man rule under the Caesars, though they would carefully avoid the title king that had become anathema to Roman ears. Throughout all these transformations, monarchy, republic, empire, the founding myths remained central to Roman identity. Poets like Virgil would elaborate on them, connecting Rome's origins not just to Romulus, but back further to Aeneas, the Trojan hero who escaped burning Troy and whose descendants would found both Alba Longa and Rome. This gave Rome an even deeper pedigree, linking the city to the heroic age described by Homer. making Romans the heirs of Troy's glory. Historians like Livy would compile and preserve the legends, treating them as history, even while acknowledging the uncertainty surrounding events so long ago. For Livy, the founding myths were true in a deeper sense than mere factual accuracy. They were true to Roman character. They revealed the essential nature of the Roman people. They explained how a small city on the Tiber had grown into the greatest power the world had ever. When Rome's power was at its height, when the city ruled an empire that encompassed much of the known world, Romans looked back at their mythical origins with a mixture of pride and wonder. They had come so far from the she-wolf's cave, from the fratricide on the Palatine, from the desperate abduction of the Sabine women. Yet those origins remained part of them, defining something essential about what it meant to be Roman. The founding myths taught that Rome was destined for greatness, marked out by the gods for a special role in history. They taught that Rome succeeded not despite its violent, chaotic origins, but perhaps because of them. The city had been forged in hardship, had learned from the beginning that survival required strength, adaptability, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary. They taught that Romans were different from other peoples, fiercer, more practical, less bound by conventional morality when the city's interests were at stake. But they also taught that Rome had the capacity to incorporate others, to turn enemies into citizens, to build something larger than any single tribe or ethnicity. And they taught that Rome, like Romulus and Remus, had drunk from the wolf's teats, had been nurtured by wildness, carried within itself something untamed and dangerous. Rome could never be fully civilized, never be gentle or peaceable. The capacity for violence was part of its inheritance, inseparable from the qualities that made it great. As centuries passed and the Roman Empire eventually fell, as the city that had ruled the world declined into poverty and ruin, the founding myths persisted. Christian writers would reinterpret them, finding new meanings, sometimes condemning the paganism and violence they contained, sometimes admiring the virtues they exemplified. Medieval and Renaissance scholars would study them, trying to understand the secret of Rome's success, hoping to recover some of the greatness that had been lost. Artists would continue to depict the she-wolf and the twins, the rape of the Sabines, the death of Remus, the apotheosis of Romulus. These images would appear in palaces and churches, in books and paintings, carrying the stories forward to audiences far removed from ancient Rome. And even today, in our modern world that seems so distant from that ancient time, the founding myths of Rome still resonate. We still recognize the wolf and the twins. We still tell the story of Romulus and Remus in classrooms and books. The legends have outlived the city that created them, have transcended their original context to become part of our shared human heritage. What is it about these stories that gives them such enduring power? Perhaps it is their honesty about human nature. They do not pretend that greatness comes from purity or that civilization is built by saints. They acknowledge the violence, the ambition, the moral compromises that are often necessary for survival and success. They show us that even the most magnificent achievements often have dark origins, that glory and tragedy are inextricably intertwined. Or perhaps it is their mythic quality, the way they connect human action to divine purpose, giving meaning and significance to events that might otherwise seem random or meaningless. The she-wolf was not merely an animal, but an agent of the gods. Romulus was not merely a man, but a child of Mars, destined for apotheosis. Rome was not merely a city, but a divine project, part of the gods' plan for the world. Or perhaps it is simply that these are good stories, compelling narratives with strong characters, dramatic conflicts, and moments of genuine emotion and insight. They work as stories, capturing something true about ambition and loyalty, violence and civilization, the bonds between brothers and the costs of power. Whatever the reason, the founding myths of Rome have endured, have been told and retold, have been adapted and reinterpreted, have inspired countless works of art and literature and thought. They have become part of how we understand not just ancient Rome, but human history more broadly, the eternal patterns of rise and fall, creation and destruction, hope and tragedy that mark our collective journey. As we drift toward sleep, contemplating these ancient stories from the mythical past of a city that once ruled the world, we can feel the weight of all those centuries, all those lives lived in the shadow of these legends. We can imagine the Tiber flowing as it still flows, past the hills where Romulus once stood, through the landscape that has seen so much history. We can hear the echo of the she-wolf's howl, calling across the millennia, reminding us of the wildness that lurks beneath civilization's thin veneer. And we can rest, knowing that these stories have survived so long because they contain truths that do not expire, insights into human nature that remain valid across ages and cultures. The myths of Rome's founding are not dead history, but living stories, continuing to speak to us even now, even here, even as we close our eyes and let the past wash over us like a gentle tide. The city is quiet now, its people sleeping, its streets empty beneath the stars. The hills stand eternal, unchanged by the passing of empires. The river flows on, as it has always flowed, carrying away the debris of history, moving always toward the sea. And somewhere in the darkness, in the space between waking and dreaming, the she-wolf still nurses the twins. The brothers still stand on their hills, watching for birds. The women still run between the armies, crying for peace. The legends sleep, but never die, waiting patiently for each new generation to discover them, to find in them whatever meanings serve the present moment, to add their own interpretations to the endless conversation about what it means to build something great, to found a city, to leave a legacy that will outlast our brief lives. And so we let the stories carry us down into rest, into the quiet darkness where all the ages meet, where past and present dissolve into the timeless realm of myth and memory. The founding of Rome recedes into the distance, not forgotten but transformed into something both less and more than history, a dream of origins, a vision of beginnings, an echo of a time when the world was young and anything seemed possible, when two brothers stood on a hill beside a river and imagined a city that would someday cast its shadow across the entire world. Rest now. The stories are safe. The legends endure. The city sleeps, dreaming of its past and future, held in the arms of time like the twins in the arms of the she-wolf. Everything that rises must fall, but everything that falls leaves traces, leaves memories, leaves stories that persist long after the stones have crumbled and the walls have fallen. Rome began in myth and legend, in the space between history and imagination. And there it remains, eternal and unchanging, a city of dreams built on the foundation of stories that will never end.